Okay, welcome to Monday live stream. I see that there's a few of you out there just right off the bat. We'll see if we can get some more people on here. But um, I was thinking of what to do this stream on today, and something that I love talking about, and I know a lot of people online like talking about, um, is the just general limitations that sometimes we face in Logic. I think this is really useful because if we talk about them, then I think that we can kind of brainstorm how to make these things work. Every workstation has some limitations. Certainly, Logic is not the only one that sometimes has issues. Pro Tools, I've seen, in sessions with 200 musicians on a sound stage, and it just crashes and deletes everything. It happens. I mean, every workstation has its flaws, but I'm interested in seeing kind of what you might all think about your own issues with Logic, and I'm going to talk a little bit about mine as well. Because I think that there's some stuff with this. So the first thing I just prepped up here was one of my favorite techniques with Logic. And with this technique, I've got the retro synth, and I've got a MIDI effect arpeggiator loaded up. And then I wanted the arpeggiator not just to control notes, but also to control this equalization curve down here. Because I love being able to add layers of things that are happening here. So what I have is this arpeggiator, just playing whatever notes I'm doing. But then after the arpeggiator, I put a modifier, and I set the input event to note number, and the reassignment, I just said learn plugin parameter, and I controlled the frequency of the green band here. But it's also going through, which means the arpeggiator still controls the notes, but it's also controlling the frequency. And I love that. I love that we can do that. But this brings me to one of my favorite issues that I have with Logic, and that is we can't just do that on every single track. This is really limited to tracks that you can do this with MIDI effects, at least easily. Now, we can use the environment to reroute some stuff, and there's some other ways to do this with side chains. But in terms of just loading up a MIDI effect and controlling things this way, I mean, this is a limiting thing about Logic. I wish that they would add MIDI effects to every channel. So that way with audio files, I could do this like on a recording I've made with a microphone and be able to do that, because I think that having this ability, this really cool ability with having the arpeggiator control a frequency of an equalizer, I think that's pretty awesome. But I mean, that's super awesome. I wish I could do that with like a guitar part really easily. So that's the thing. Almost all of these things you could do in different ways. You can do with automation. You can do this with just drawing in those things instead of using a MIDI effect. But there's something that's really powerful about having this instant access. And so just having it in the one place with MIDI and the instrument tracks really is really limiting. So what kind of things like that do you find? And I'm asking you who are watching, what problems do you run into when you're using Logic? Which things do you wish would change that we could expand out? And maybe, collectively we could figure out if there's a way to like do those things. Maybe they're not impossible. Maybe they're just impractical. Maybe it's that there's a way to do them that's easy and you just don't know about it. But I'm curious on what you're thinking. And the first comment from Raccoon, if I do, may I have a boost on performance or the opposite? I don't understand what your question is about. Maybe give me a little bit more information. Reeks is asking, what is the difference between Logic Overdrive and Logic Distortion? Those are really good questions. And actually, this brings me up to a different issue I have with Logic. And this would be that sometimes there's some confusion about some of these things. So let me pull open those two things real quick. So you were asking about overdrive and distortion. And you can see there's 6 different tools here in the distortion menu. We have Bit Crusher, Clip Distortion, Distortion, Distortion 2, Overdrive, and Phase Distortion. And so each of these are going to do things just slightly differently, but they're all going to be somewhat related. And so some of these are going to control, for instance, the harmonics that are there, and some of them will do it in different ways. If you're ever wondering more about this, so for instance, you're like, I wish I knew the difference between these things. You could go to the manual. You could use the quick help to a certain degree, because some of these don't actually show us exactly what's there. But I think, let's see if these pop up. They're actually not popping up with the shortcut, which is Command /. Yeah, so they don't actually pop up. I was thinking they might, but let's go into the Logic Pro effects for a second. And I'm curious if these actually have a little bit better description in here. So we have the distortion effects. And with this one, it simulates the low fidelity distortion generated by a bipolar transistor. So that's like an emulation of a transistor distortion unit. And then overdrive emulates the distortion produced by a field effect transistor, FET, commonly used in solid-state musical instrument amplifiers and hardware effects devices. The real simple way to look at the differences is that they're just different, a different process to get there, and a different color as the end result. And you can get different effects out of them. So if you're not liking how one of them sounds, you can load up a different one. I don't use too much either one of these. If I'm looking for very specific types of distortion, it's usually a mimic of like a guitar amp. And so I'm almost always reaching out for our amps and pedals. So the amp designer or the pedal board, which have distortion units that I think try to make it sound more like a guitar type sound. But if I'm ever looking for something that isn't being met with either the guitar pedals or the amp designer, I almost am always going for the Bit Crusher. Has a certain style that I like, and distortion 2 and clip distortion, not too much, but I will reach for one of these and just see if I can get the sound I'm looking for. But there's so many different tools. And so one of the problems becomes, how do we know which of these to use? And that becomes a real issue. The more that Apple has in terms of content on a product like this, the harder it is sometimes to be fully aware of every little nuance on what you even have. So I hope that helps a little bit, but they definitely, the documentation seems to most of the time hold up and be able to explain a little bit more of what's happening with each of those plugins. And then Raccoon says, if you go into Logic Preferences at Sampler section, you can choose between local or external locations for samplers to look up for. I see. I don't know the definitive answer, Raccoon, on this, but I do know that I keep everything on external drives, especially with the M1 processor. I try to keep as much off my main drive as possible because One of the limitations with the original M1 is the ability to pull things, or to the RAM limitation. And so that RAM limitation ends up being that we have a lot more virtual RAM happening on the primary hard drive. And so it still needs to have memory to access. It just happens that it's going to use the primary drive instead of RAM because you run out of RAM. And so I keep everything off the main drive and everything on external drives, and it gives me a performance boost for sure. And then Reeks is following up. Thank you for the reply. Could you please also say what do you like more, Logic's Distortion or Studio One red light distortion, and their differences? I can't really speak much to the Studio One. I have used Studio One on a number of occasions, and everything sounded fine to me. I hardly ever think that a distortion unit is the limiting factor on a production. It's like someone at the university where I teach, we often have students working in Pro Tools as beginners, and I've heard people complain about like the Reverb, that's the basic reverb that comes with Pro Tools. They've expanded with a couple other options, but everyone would say like, I don't like how Reverb sounds. You can't make it sound what you want it to. And I keep on thinking and teaching, I was like, this is not the limiting factor on your project. If your project doesn't sound good, it's not because of the Reverb. It's usually because of the original instruments you've recorded or the music that you've made. And I think that this is a very similar thing. There's enough tools in Logic and even in Studio One in terms of distortion that you should be able to go through and get the one you want. But I'm actually, I think I'm a big fan of, as much as possible, if you're looking, for instance, for guitar distortion, I'm the biggest fan of having a guitar player get that sound out on their amp and their effects, and doing less of it inside Logic. If it's something that's not a true guitar sound that I'm looking for, then the creative tools are the limit. I mean, there's so many different variations on distortion you can come up with. So you just need to know what you want. If you don't know what you want, that's a different issue altogether. I think you need to kind of figure out exactly what you're looking for, because it could be that you want to do a super boosty EQ followed by a really hard, heavy limiter, and you're going to come up with some really, typical digital distortion there that you created in a different, maybe breaking the rules kind of way. That doesn't make it wrong. It just means that, you're come up with something using those tools in a different way. So you have to really decide what you want from it. And if you don't know that, then that becomes a separate issue altogether. I don't know how to change that setting for Logic Sampler in the preferences. Oh, if you have to. I still have to probably look up more about this, Raccoon, just because let's see where you're talking about here. So preferences, you're saying the sampler section. Where? Right here. So sample storage, search samples on all volumes. I think this is actually something different. So I just pulled open the preferences for that. Pop-up menu determines the locations that sampler searches for instrument samples. Local volume sampler searches storage media attached to or installed in the computer for samplers. Sampler searches storage media for accessible over a network for samples in all volumes. So this is, that's different. External volumes is talking about over a network. So local volumes means that that's your main hard drive or attached hard drive. So I would leave it there either way, because unless you have a network setup attached, then you wouldn't need the external volumes. Man, I think this is a carryover because I don't know how much this really applies to what most people are doing. So I don't know. That's a good question, but I think that that's something totally different in a way. Other questions. Those are good questions. I don't know if I have the full answer for that specific one, except for looking at the manual. It looks like local volumes is what you should be selecting for that for sure, unless you have some sort of network configuration. And then it's interesting that the rest of these are actually here. You'd think that some of these settings would be in the sampler itself, not in the preferences. Anyway, I think there's anything in the virtual menu here. The virtual memory, active for sure. And if you're having issues with things getting read quickly enough, then sometimes this is the right place to come to change this. But this just tells it how much to load in the memory before it has to go find it. And so if you're having a situation where you're playing a sampled instrument and the key, like you play a note and it's not playing back at all, or like if it's choppy, then you can change these settings to work on that a little bit. Cool. An external SSD is considered an attached one, but not a network one. So that was another question from Raccoon just now. Okay. Any other questions? I'll go on to another example of logic issues that I think some of us are facing, unless I see something else come through in the chat. Okay. And I've made videos about a lot of some of these things in the past. Some of the MIDI functionality is a little bit wonky still, but it's gotten so much better over the past couple years. The ability to choose the MIDI import as well as the input channel has really been a huge benefit in the way that I personally work, because I have a lot of keyboards. I've got my main controller right in front of me. I've got another vintage synth over on the right side. I've got like 3 or 4 different little instruments that I use. I've got a breath controller, a touch controller. I used to use Leap Motion, but that has, I think, officially stopped working for M1 configurations, and so I don't use that anymore. But I have so many different things that it's now easier to keep it all organized, at least, and that makes a big difference. I think another thing that I consider to be a little bit of an issue in terms of everything logic related would be that right this moment, at least, the transition to silicon with the M1 is, I think we finally are hitting a breaking point with the new Mac Studio computer that's been announced and released. Because I think a lot of creative companies now realize that the experiment to go to the M1 architecture is real, and that it's going to happen, and that hopefully they'll start really finishing the plugins and making them universally compatible. Because I'm still running in Rosetta half the time just because there's a few plugins which sometimes I use which aren't universal, and so I think that right now, being tied to Apple, Logic sometimes has a huge advantage and a huge disadvantage because I think that, for instance, when the M1 came out, Pro Tools and even Ableton and some of the others, they all said, you know what, don't upgrade. We can't run on this right now. We haven't tested anything. And Logic from day one said, yeah, we work. We know we work because we're from the same company. And so, that's like a double-edged sword. It felt like, okay, I can see what this is all about. And then you realize that if you have any third-party plugins, that there was a chance that they would crash your system. And so it's nice to be in the future as they release hardware, but it's also kind of scary sometimes to do that. Okay, there were a couple more questions that came in. Nicola says, how to balance a project in a mono file. First of all, explain to me why you would want to bounce it to a mono file. I need to know more of why you would want to do that. More partly because I'm curious, but also partly because it's an interesting things. And then while you're answering that, the music man says, great stream, thanks. Would you go with Flex Time or is Melodyne worth to buy? Oh my gosh. I can give you my really biased personal opinion on this. And that is, Flex Time is good enough if whatever you're using for with it is good enough. So if you're working with a really good musician, who, like a singer, for instance, and they're an amazing singer, and they just happen to like hit one note slightly out of tune, flex pitch is good enough to fix that. Or if you're working with a musician whose timing just falls out for like a bar, flex time is good enough to fix that. If you are like, you know what, it's like I sang a song and I'm using flex pitch and I can hear all these artifacts all over it, then perhaps rethink your career as a singer or practice more, because there's a line there that if it's far enough out, flex pitch or time can't fix it. And Melodyne they're gonna have the similar issue. Their line is further away. And what I mean by that is if you have a vocal performance that's out of tune and slightly out of time, the line of what can be fixed by flex pitch and flex time it's going to be a different threshold than Melodyne. Melodyne can probably fix things that are further out of pitch and time, and then flex will fix things that are a little bit closer to accurate without artifacts. Because I think Melodyne, that's with that software, that's all they really do, and with Logic they do everything. So you don't have like a team of people, really innovating in that one area as much. And so you end up with tools that are just overall better, and they're focused on a different business model, and so they have a lot of skin in the game to make it sound really good. And so if you are working with really crappy musicians, then Melodyne may be like the better choice to go with. But if you're working with things that are not quite as bad, I use Flex all the time with certain things. And if I use it in small amounts to fix things, then no one knows. And so you don't hear artifacts. But if you hear artifacts, it means that something was really bad in the first place. I'll go down some more of these. Grambiance has an RC505 looper trying to figure out how to make Logic slave to the tempo on the clock on the 505 main stage, just syncs them automatically. So I don't know all the intricate parts of the RC505 looper. What I do know is that Logic doesn't like to follow anybody's tempo, but it sure does like to send out tempo. So you'd have to set, I think, the RC505 to accept the tempo, and then Logic can distribute the tempo to that device. And I think, let me see. Yeah, so it can chase timecode, but I'm pretty sure under your project settings, under synchronization, you can set destination to whichever thing that devices connect to and send out clock data, as well as PDC, MTC, and MMC. but it can't chase any of it. So you'd have to make Logic the source, and you'd have to make the RC505 the destination, and have Hit receive the MIDI time. If you want to go the other way around, then Logic is not your piece of software. It's actually another example of a huge problem. Logic, I wish it would accept MIDI timings like that and chase it, but it just doesn't. It just sends it out. So I hope I answered your question there, Grambians. I think I did. Multi-music, man. What is that breath controller? Leaning over. It's this right here. It's the Hornberg HB1. It's a beast. It's $850 to just monitor your breath and convert it to MIDI data. I got it as part of a project I was working on. I don't think if I had $850, I wouldn't be buying a breath controller. But if you did have $850 and wanted a breath controller, that by far is the best. It is so good. It is so sensitive. It is like perfection. Made by, I think, a German company. But it's like a perfect engineering feat of wonder. It's amazing. Let's see. Grambian says, interesting because when I use Mainstays is fine, but being a slave to my 505, it seems to be the default behavior. I thought Logic and Mainstays were the same. They're actually not the same in that one way, as far as I can tell. I've never been able to get Logic to do that, but Mainstays has a little bit different feature set. So, yeah, issues with Logic, right? Why can't it? Daryl Howard says, built audio editors and Waveburner Pro. Should Apple bring back some of that functionality? Waveburner. I was just thinking about Waveburner the other day. I couldn't remember the name of it. Part of that is because I'm getting old, right? You can't remember things anymore, but it's just been so long. No, I don't think it should bring back Waveburner functionality. Because Waveburner was a CD mastering tool for the most part, and I am so happy to be rid of CDs in terms of a format. Now, I'm not talking about the ability for musicians to earn money selling CDs. I think that's still a really valid revenue stream for some people. But I think right now the cooler thing would be to go to one of the LP pressing plants and release things in that format. You can sell them for twice as much money, and people think that's a really cool form factor. So if you really want a physical format, do that instead of going to CDs anyway, or go to cassettes, because cassettes have a resurgence right now. But I love as a consumer. I'm thinking I have to separate these out a little bit. As a consumer, I love the streaming part because I want to be able to just think of a song that I'm thinking of while I'm driving down the road and say, hey, Siri, play blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden starts playing magically in my car. That's cool, access-wise. And as a consumer, just being able to enjoy music, I really like that. So no, let's not go back to burning discs if we can help it. Please. Big Sur or Monterey for Logic Pro 10.7.2. Well, I can only speak for myself because I've talked to people. People come to me. I do private lessons one-on-one outside of YouTube channel. I've got like 4 or 5 people that I meet with every week. And one of them is always having issues with their Logic crashing, and it's like there's so many different factors, but I'm on the latest of everything. I always go to the latest with my M1 because there's a good chance that whatever they're doing, it's like maybe a 25% 75% chance that it's going to make it better, and 25% chance that I'm going to get totally hosed. And so I always kind of ride the line, so to speak. So I'm on the latest with Monterey, And I think that so far, Logic has only crashed like one time since I've updated to the newest version of the operating system. And I'm sure it was some other fault. It wasn't just something that I don't think it was because of that. But I also keep a pretty tight ship in terms of what I put on this computer. And because I need it to work well. And I do have to have certain things on there like Zoom, because I teach over Zoom. And I have to have stuff for streaming like this. And I have some Adobe products because I use those for certain things. And then I've got like Final Cut and Logic Pro, but I'm only running the minimum things at one time. I got this M1 computer mostly as just like a trial run, right? Back when they first were announced, they were so cheap, and I got the M1 8 gigabytes of RAM version, thinking that it was going to be like a toy that I could mess around with. And it blew me away. I mean, the bare basic model of this M1 architecture far exceeded anything I was expecting. The only area it has an issue with is sometimes with the spatial audio stuff. But even then, I mean, if you set it up right and keep control over what's open and how it's running, then I think it works really well. And I was like, you know what? I'll just get the next M1 when it comes out. The big, whatever would be next, which we now know what it is. But I just kept on thinking, when I hit the ceiling on this thing, then I will do that. And so far, I've never hit the ceiling. I mean, this thing, the fan has never come on it. I don't think once. And it runs amazingly. I can do all of my medium to large sessions in very small buffer sizes. And as long as I keep my main hard drive with at least 30 to 40 gigabytes of space, because it's using that as RAM, the virtual RAM stuff. So it's, as long as I keep space on there, everything works really nice. Cool. Good questions from those of you participating. That's why I do these things, because I think it's I'm trying to get this a little bit more of a real-time feel for the channel. I think that for me, the interactivity between you all is what I'm interested in, because I think that we get better at this stuff as we kind of talk about it, instead of making a video on YouTube and having a bunch of random people watch it and sometimes leaving with more questions than answers. I'd rather, if we have a chance to, do some of this in real time and make the community stronger, I think that that's a really important thing. Cool. Trying to think. So over the years, Logic has always implemented the things that I wish it would have. And that's just a fluke, but there have been, I used to have a list of like the top 5 things I hated about Logic. And most of them were working well in Nuendo and Cubase. And there was a time that I almost was really going to be a Cubase or a Nuendo user. But there's one thing that's always kept me back from doing that, and that is I hate paying for updates. I mean, I can afford to, I think, at this point, but it's just like, it's frustrating. I know that there's companies who do this in different ways. FL Studio has lifetime free updates. Apple so far has been really good about Logic updates and making them free. The problem with Apple and Logic is that you get free software updates, but they keep on piling on features. I mean, they love it. They're like, ooh, we just bought Alchemy. That's going to bring us in a couple $1 million worth of computer sales. Because someone's going to say, ooh, I want to use Alchemy and Logic, and they're going to realize that their computer can run one instance of it. You know what I mean? So it's like, holy crap. So their business model, I think, at least from my observation, is that they're in hardware sales, and they're willing to give you a lot of free software so that you need to do the hardware updates. Spatial audio is another example of that, right? So that was the latest one with 10.7, and they gave us spatial audio for free. And all of a sudden, a bunch of people who were like, ooh, I want to try that out, realized they're like, oh my my computer can't do this. And so then they have to go out and buy a newer computer. Then there's the Mac Studio, which is aimed at people running Logic and Final Cut. And so, of course, all of us are like, oh, I really want that computer. I wonder if I can afford to do that. And the real answer should be not if you can find a way to do it, but do you really need to do it right this moment? I have I had a good friend and mentor named Rich Sanders who was a professor at the same school where I teach. He passed away a number of years ago, but he always used to talk about, the field of dreams mentality. And he would say, don't think of it as build it and they will come. He's like, don't, because this is the audio industry, not a magical baseball diamond. He's like, there's a good chance that even if you build it, they're not going to come, and then you're just going to be in debt. And so his encouragement was always to use what you have to its maximum ability. And then as jobs come in that pay you, you can expand responsibly. I mean, that's the best advice I ever got. I had peers in college who would get student loans, and instead of using them, they could pay the tuition, or their family was paying tuition. They'd get the student loans to buy computers to build their home studio. And I just kept on thinking at the time, I'm like, buy good microphones and good preamps, things that'll last for your whole career. Don't buy a computer with that money, because it's going to be obsolete before you graduate. And that money is still going to be gone. And so I think that that's an important thing. James says, how do we become the better producers with Logic? How can we get to the next level? That is a great question. I think it's a really important one to ask, because I think that you can become a great producer with something far less than Logic. And the tools themselves don't make you a great producer. It's what's in your head and your skill level. I think part of that comes from just listening to a lot of music. I think understanding what's out there. But then when it comes time for you to work on your own, to be able to shut kind of that out. You don't want to necessarily always be comparing. You want to create something that's meaningful. And so for me, and I think this is true for a lot of people, it depends on what genre you're working in, but the best things that I've ever worked on were because the people who I was recording were the best. And so the source matters so much, the source idea, the source musician. And musicians get to be good because they're insane at practicing and really developing that skill. And so if you think that becoming the best in Logic has anything to do with Logic, I think that's one of the falsehoods that we sometimes believe, that a piece of software is going to somehow make our music better, when in reality, the music being better has to come first. I have a friend who works in Nashville, and he used to say when he was a student that he thought he was mediocre at best, sometimes not a great engineer. And then he landed his first job in Nashville's studio, and he realized really quickly that he was actually a really good engineer, at least good enough to do really great sounding things, because when he set up the microphone, it was in front of somebody who sounded good. And when he was a student, he would set up microphones in front of other students doing their projects who were just mediocre at best. And so you put your music tools in front of amazing musicians, and you're going to walk away with amazing music. And so I think that that's really important. So if you're like, I feel like my mixes and stuff are mediocre, ask yourself some really hard questions. I mean, is it something that you're doing that's mediocre and that Logic can't fix? Now, in terms of tools, if I'm working with mediocre musicians, I got to be using Logic. Logic is the best at working with mediocre musicians. Between the groove track and flex time and pitch and things like the drummer, which can follow along to other musicians, and the adapt tempo, which you can record free without a click track, fix the tempo, remove all the tempo discrepancies, and add other parts to it. I mean, if I'm working with a band that's mediocre, this is the only thing I want to be using because it's so easy to go from a mediocre place to a great place using these tools. And so I think that this is that's the thing, that's the important part. But if you want to go from being a good to a great producer, that's a change that has to happen inside you, not with your tools. And so, uh, or sometimes, I mean, there are some techniques you have to learn, and you have to get to the point where the software is no longer impeding your path. So, it's like somebody will ask me, how do I get my reverb to sound good? Or what do I do with my EQ? It's like, get past that point, start thinking about the bigger brush strokes. And every time you think of an idea musically that's going to be working or powerful, then you just, reach for the tools that do it. That's where you have to get with Logic or any digital audio workstation. You have to get to the point where you can just reach out for the tool you need at that moment, and you're going to be able to get what you need. So, someone hands you a bass track to put on a song, and it's like muddy, non-energetic, and slightly out of tune. You don't want to sit there and think, well, what do I do now? It's like you want to grab an equalizer to maybe thin it out just a little bit in the muddy range. And you want to use a little bit of flex pitch to get those couple notes in tune. And then you want to set it, make one other track on your song the groove source and make that follow the groove. And then it's going to add the energy back into it. So it's like you really quickly reach for those three things and you make those changes, and then your song is a lot better because of it. That's like the point where you need to be. And if you're still like wondering what some of these things do in Logic, then do what you're doing right now. Go on YouTube and follow people who can make you better. Ask questions like you're asking. If that's not an option, or if it's not working for you, then invest in time to read the manual. It's all there. I've read the manual more than once in my life, just because, every time a new thing comes out, I want to see how it works and if it's going to help. And I'm a teacher, so I teach, and I need to know things to teach. It's like I do one-on-one lessons outside of everything else I do. And it's people who are asking those questions, and we go through all the different stuff. So find a mentor someplace who can teach you stuff. And so all of those things will help. The multi-music man says, I agree. I have to go and practice my instruments. Thanks again for the live session. You're welcome. That's right. That's the other thing. If you're sitting here and not practicing, think of all the other people who are. That's something I tell my students at the university. The success rate to get into this industry is smaller than some other industries. You have to really give a lot, and it takes time and energy, and it's not a guarantee that if you can do this that you'll make a living at it, but it's possible to, and it just means you got to be in the right place all the time, so that when the right time comes that you're ready for it. And so being in the right place means having your skills honed and, being able to understand the musical part of this, and having no stone left unturned when it comes to preparing yourself in any way you possibly can, making the right connections. I mean, this business is more about networking than it is about knowing things. I mean, we all know that certain people make it even when we feel like that perhaps there's somebody else more qualified, and that's not fair, but it's also the way it kind of is. So you got to be playing that same game, networking and meeting people and getting that set up. I'm sorry, Victor, that your Logic is constantly crashing. I don't know if you're using 10.5 with Catalina. It has been just long enough, but almost all the time when something's crashing, it's something silly. For instance, one of your hard drives is full, or one of your hard drives is failing, or it could be that you have a third-party plugin which isn't compatible with your system. So I always start by saying remove every third-party plugin that you have installed, and then bring them back in one at a time and see if you can figure out which one or combination of plugins is causing it to crash. Otherwise, Logic as a piece of software is relatively stable. It doesn't have a lot of crashes all by itself. I can't say that that's 100% true in every case, but most of the time, Logic is very stable with the operating system. I mean, they're made by the same people, they're programmed to run, and if it's been approved to be installed in a certain version of the OS, then it typically works. So that means something else is causing it, and you have to kind of go through each one of those things and eliminate what may be happening in a very calculated way, so that you can track when it starts working to what was causing it, and then you just don't use that thing that caused it. We're trying to go up until 15 more minutes. I'm trying to do these live streams for about an hour. I need the live streams. I think that it's a little bit more my speed this month. March is the month of live streams for me. Then after March, I think in April it'll be something else. But for now, we're trying to do it. Yeah, well, Arturia. I mean, I stopped using Arturia 1 because it crashes. It's like some of the most buggy, crappy software. I gotta be careful. YouTube likes to demonetize me when I say things that are derogatory towards companies. So I love Arturia; they're the best. But I stopped using them because they crashed all the time, and I don't expect it to be a smooth transition to M1 for them. They seem to be kind of like that kind of company. So that's my 2 cents. Yes, Raccoon, you're talking about 13-inch MacBook Pro with i5. Anything i5 is going to be kicking on the fan a lot. It just is one of those inefficient chips that's almost not powerful enough to do what you're asking it to, and so it's definitely going to heat up, and then performance will lag over time. So for better or worse, what I would do if I was running still on an i5 MacBook Pro, I would be freezing my tracks a lot just to keep as much off of the processor as possible. Just keep things frozen until you need to edit them, and then free them up. Victor says it could be because of my storage starting to get full, but I thought it's not related. Try to get space, maybe it will work. Yeah, so Victor, I mean, that's happened to me. The only time my computer ever acts weird is when the hard drive starts getting full. Apple, the way that their operating system works, and someone who's a software engineer would know far more about this than I do, but so much of their way that their system works relies on having open space on the hard drive. And I'm assuming this is a similar thing with Windows and Linux. But they all need that space to do certain things, and there's so much stored in caches and temporary places that if it starts getting full, it's just everything starts acting weird. And so I try to keep my system drive at least for my M1 right now. I don't even know what I have. I'll look right here, but I try to keep it as empty as possible, and just the most important stuff on there. I'm looking at it right now just because I'm curious what I got. Not enough. I just have about 20 gigs right now. Oof, I wonder why that is. I'm going to delete my garbage and see what if I put anything in there that takes up space. Because 20 gigs is not enough. I guess I need to go through. Yeah, they gave me another gig or two. Oh, I guess this afternoon, I'm going to be cleaning up my main drive because I do think that matters. That 20 gigs is like a bare minimum on an M1. I try to keep it twice as much of that, but I'll have to figure it out. What just jumped up in space. So much crap. Other questions or anything? Let's see, there were a couple more things that came in. Ellie Winter says, I've had that happen as well. I have to get rid of a lot of samples I was keeping on my computer, including most of the Logic stock sounds. And I keep as much of that on an external drive as I can. But every once in a while things pop in. And I'm just like, there's my documents folder. Keep on my other screen here. I know what it is. I just I have a 12 gigabyte QuickTime movie in my download folder from a project I was working on with some students. And so that's the other 12 gigs right now is just in a single movie file that I'm about to copy to a new place because it needs to go. David's, okay, there it is. Yep, so my favorite key command on a computer is to click drag a file, hold down the command key before you let it go. And, looks like I already did put it there. Okay, so we're going to delete the original. I like how that sounds. And then if you hold the command key, it moves it. It doesn't copy it. And so you can move it to an external drive, and as soon as it's done moving, it'll delete it from the original place. And now I'm back up to 30 something. Cool. So many of you didn't come in at the very beginning of this, but I was talking about one of my favorite techniques here in terms of MIDI effects. This thing is awesome. When you convert, let's see, where is it? There it is. Arpeggiation data. So I've got a synth playing. I have an arpeggiator controlling that synthesizer, but after the arpeggiator, I have a modifier which is converting the note number, and I reassigned it to the channel EQ frequency. So that EQ frequency just moves around depending on what note is being played through the arpeggiator, and you can scale it differently. So the whole point, we started on this this whole thread talking about how this is such a cool technique, but you can't easily do it with audio tracks. And so it's such one of those just like stupid things where Logic says, you know what, we want to give you some of the coolest techniques ever and then allow you to use them in one place. And if you want to use them in other place, you have to do a workaround. How dumb. So that's the whole point of this whole video, is just talking about some of these things that Logic does that make us scratch our heads a little bit and think, why wouldn't you just put this on an audio track as well? Let's see. Raccoon says, can we store user patches on an external SSD where we relocate the Logic library? I was reading something. I haven't tried this out, but maybe it's worth trying it right this minute. I don't know. So the user patches as a default are in our music folder under the audio music apps. And then we have things in here. So I feel like there's a way to do this with an alias. So make an alias and then copy that folder to an external drive. I think I was reading somewhere that you can do that, but I don't know if it works with these or not. The thing about these are that, this whole folder for me right now is only 2 gigabytes. So it's not a ton, but a lot of those are my auto sampled instruments, which I just have a few of them on this drive. Those I could move off because you can always, reload them in from different places. You don't have to have them in one place. It's just easier here because they'll show up in the file structure automatically. So I think maybe the alias thing would probably work. I know the library you can now use an alias for sure. I just don't know about that particular set of folders or not. And then Ellie Winter saying Kilohertz Snap Heap lets you do this if you get the slice EQ from ADSR for free with any purchase. You can do this note tracking on audio tracks. Yeah, but exactly, and this is my point exactly. I think that you can even do this in Logic in certain ways. It's not like you're blocked from doing this in Logic. You can do it as a sidechain. You can also do it through the environment, or you can do it through this other third-party thing. Darn it, I want it just to work as a MIDI effect on an audio track. I mean, that's, again, ease of use for me is such a huge thing. I want to be able to just create. I want to just be able to go with an idea. And I'm at the point with Logic where I don't think all that much about stuff. I'm using it, and I know exactly what I'm doing with all of the different tools. I'm very fast with editing and creation, but every once in a while it's like I want to do this thing, and then I'm like, oh, now it's like I've got to think of a way to do this. When that happens, when there's a crevice in the workflow, that's what bothers me with this. And so the way you do that, so for instance, so the question from Ellie Winter is, how do you note track with sidechain? That's a good question. I will show you one of the ways to do that right now. So I'm going to turn off the retro synth. I'm going to load in here a compressor. Compressor works. Sidechain. And let's just load up, because we can do this with the drummer track. We'll loop a little section of this. The sidechain here is going to be the drummer. I'm going to set stereo out to no output for a second. I don't know if it'll still play actually. Yeah, so it's working. You can see the sidechain coming through. But so I can see it here. Compression, sidechain, listen, maybe. You can hear that happening with the drums now, right? So any audio track you can do that with. If you sidechain it into an instrument track that has that same chain on it, then it would work. Did that make sense, Ellie Winter? Well, let me know. I think we're on like a 4-second delay or 5-second delay in the stream. We got about 1 minute left. But this is a workaround with the sidechain. So we're just using a sidechain to get it into an instrument track, and then any audio track can, you can send it in there and do that with. But it would be so much easier just to have MIDI effects on audio tracks and then have a MIDI input on those ones to control things. Yeah, so the sidechain signal brings everything on the track you are sidechaining from exactly. And Wolf Composer saying clip gain. control with key commands, currently not available in Logic. I use a third-party app. So I was just looking at this with my university students last week. So I'm just going to bring out an Apple loop here. I don't know how it is in Ableton now that I think about it. I'd have to actually look. But in Pro Tools, clip gain happens right on the clip. In Logic, what we have to do is come over here to our actual region controls in the inspector, and then I can do clip gain from there. And I wonder, I have so many questions about this. This may be the source of a new video I make. I want to see if doing the clip gain here has any sort of MIDI output that I can find in the environment or some other place. Because if we had that, then man, we could do some amazing things. But I haven't seen anything with key commands, so you're probably right about that. However, the other thing that is that I wish we had, I would use this feature all the time if I could, and that's selection-based processing. The thing that's wrong with selection-based processing is that there's no history. So I can't make a change, close this window, and come back and make changes later. It's like a permanent application, then you'd have to undo it, which is like if you've done 100 things afterwards, it's useless. So typically, if I need to do this type of processing, I'll come over here to my track header components, make sure that track alternatives is turned on. I'll say, let's do a duplicate. So then I can come through and do something like, here's a lo-fi digital channel strip. Let's select that. We'll apply it. So now that has this this chain on there. And if I don't want it anymore, I can just simply go back to the A alternative and get that. I can even, copy it, go back to B, and then paste it right on in here and then put it, wherever I want. So, there are ways around it, but again, I wish we had a history of the selection-based processing like they do in Cubase and Nuendo. That'd be so much easier. And then Ellie Winter says, I use CRM effects to cart audio from an audio track into a MIDI track. Yeah, that's a good option too. And then you can cart audio into a MIDI track with Surge XT synth as well. And I do that a different way too. I use Alchemy if I need something, if I actually need audio into a MIDI track. And then when is the next live? I'm probably going to do the next live later this week. I'm going to try to do it either Thursday or Friday. And then my kids have spring break next week, so I'm probably going to be lucky to be on my computer even once. But I'm trying to do twice a week right now, just with different topics and things. Just for the moment, for the month of March, because, after March, who knows? April is going to be a really busy month, along with May, and then June. I'm taking my group of students on a study abroad to Europe, to the Czech Republic. And then after that, I'm going to be on summer break, hardcore. Any other questions before we pull the plug on this? So we had about 25 at the max, 25 of you simultaneously. Thanks for watching and thanks for signing on. Once maybe we'll eventually get like a real stable time when it's, repeated every week for this. But right now it's at 12 o'clock Mountain Standard Time. It's just after 1 o'clock now here in Denver. And so that's the time of day when I'm doing them is right from 12 to 1. So if you're like, I wonder if there's one happening, you can always check around that time, and we'll be around if we are. But find my profile on YouTube. If you have specific things, you can email me, and we could even have something prepped up if you're really curious. If you're super proactive, that's usually a good thing. But otherwise, thanks everybody, and I'm closing the stream, so I'll see you next time.